Good morning and happy Thursday. I am Briahna Joy Gray, and I'm joined here at the desk by Spencer Brown to bring you today's news and another edition of our show. Welcome back, Spencer.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Happy Friday Eve.
And we were just listening to the theme song from Welcome Back, Kotter, so it feels very appropriate that I phrased it that way. Well, as you are well aware, Kevin McCarthy is out as Speaker of the House, and the competition to elect his successor is growing more intense by the day. Representatives Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise have formally thrown their hats in the ring, and both have already seemingly gotten the thumbs up from lead Republican rebel Matt Gaetz. Here he is on Newsmax yesterday.
Who do you think would be the best candidate for Speaker? Would you go on the record now with a name? A lot of people have not put a name forward. Who's your choice, Congressman?
I think there are a lot of people in our conference who could be Speaker. I nominated Jim Jordan back in January. Obviously, he's someone I could vote for. Steve Scalise is also a great guy. I think the world of him. He's someone I could vote for. So I think that we'll see a number of talented people come forward. And I know this: if it's Speaker Jim Jordan or Speaker Steve Scalise, there will be very few conservatives in the country who don't see that as a monumental upgrade over Speaker McCarthy.
Meanwhile, President Biden has largely stayed out of Republicans' ongoing leadership crisis. However, he made this comment from the White House yesterday.
Not that they're asking you, what's your advice to the next House Speaker?
That's above my pay grade.
Thank you, sir.
According to Punchbowl News reporter Jake Sherman, he hasn't found one House Republican lawmaker or aide of consequence who believes the Speaker election will be wrapped up by next Wednesday. In the meantime, it seems the biggest legislative casualty of McCarthy's ousting will be aid to Ukraine. Per reporting in Axios, some Republicans are eyeing a grand compromise with Democrats that ties Ukraine aid to border security measures. But nothing will be accomplished before a Speaker is elected first.
A new Reuters poll released this morning finds that U.S. public support for arming Ukraine has fallen. 41% of respondents said the U.S. should provide weapons to Ukraine, while 35% disagreed. The same poll in May showed 46 backing and 29 disagreeing. Okay, so the background of this is that there's this growing and significant gap between public opinion on the war in Ukraine, or whether or not we should be sending military aid to Ukraine, and what Congress seems to want, which is over $100 billion in aid with no end in sight. Matt Gaetz seems to have exploited, and I don't mean that in a critical way, but just in a descriptive way, seems to have exploited that gap by forcing basically a vote on this issue, whether or not you're going to be willing to compromise and sell downriver this argument that they're making that we need to cut funding to Ukraine in return for other Republican priorities like the border. And it seems like we're partly in this situation because he felt like that was a Faustian compromise that he wasn't able to make. And what you're seeing from this dynamic is how much consensus there is among establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans to get aid flowing again to Ukraine. So much so that Democrats are saying, fine, potentially, I'll give you all your border funding that we've objected to on moral grounds. And AOC went down to the border all dressed in white, crying when Trump was in office. And Trump was the most fascist person ever because he wanted to build the wall. We're willing to compromise on that stuff as long as it means sending military aid to Ukraine.
It seems staggering that they would now be willing to make that compromise. Because as you pointed out, the idea of a border wall and immigration policy was, for a long time for Democrats, especially during the Trump years and continuing into the Biden years, this sort of red line that they had drawn. And it seems like now they're kind of pulling a President Obama in Syria, running over that red line because they feel that this Ukraine funding is so critically important. And it has been interesting to see that it's not just, obviously Republicans have always talked about wanting to secure the border, but to see them willing to push for a compromise that still includes the Ukraine funding when they're hearing, it seems from these polls, I assume they're hearing a lot from their constituents back in their districts about why they think that this funding should not just automatically be given, and this shouldn't be just on like a rolling basis that we keep giving them more money for aid and weapons and other things. It seems like that's kind of turned into almost Ukraine funding, that is, has turned into something like funding the government, where it's like we must do this by this deadline to make sure that they have it. Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting to watch that become sort of the lone point in Washington where anyone can agree on anything.
Yeah, and speaking of, one-time Democratic presidential hopeful, Colorado Senator Michael Bennet was on MSNBC yesterday explicitly making the case that he would filibuster the next budget bill, willing to shut down the government if the bill doesn't include aid for Ukraine. That's how serious this is. So the posture has gone from it's Republicans that want to shut down the government, and it's still true. You know, both sides want to basically shut down the government over aid to Ukraine. Yeah. But it's gone from the budget crisis is a Republican crisis, the speakership crisis is a Republican crisis. They don't care about military families getting paychecks. They don't care about government workers going without pay. They're willing to do all of this for their selfish ends, for policies that don't help the American people. They want to cut school funding for the poorest kids in America. All of that stuff was true. But now the Democrats seem to be joining, or at least some Democrats seem to be joining in this chorus saying, yes, I'm also willing to hold the country hostage for something as attenuated from the needs and interests of the average American as sending additional aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think there's a distinction between the quote you just mentioned in wanting to shut down the government over aid to Ukraine and why Republicans largely were saying those who wanted to shut down the government were willing to. Again, they were focused on cutting spending, rolling back some of the programs that Biden and the Democrats in the previous Congress had put in place, but
including Title I spending for public schools.
Right, but the Democrats and the Biden administration have always gone straight to sort of the hair on fire cases when it comes to either the debt ceiling or funding the government. We obviously saw when the debt ceiling was being debated, you had White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre making the argument that people would have their bones dissolved by acid as a result of not raising the debt ceiling. So it's always kind of this, you know, it was that in the debt ceiling, then it was children will starve if the funding doesn't continue. And so they always kind of go to the extremes. But I think
that is literally true.
The base core of it, though.
But one of the main points they were advocating for was cutting the Title I school budget by 80%. School funding by 80%. I appreciate there is a maximalist case and an exaggerated case that sometimes is made when people are trying to frame things advantageously in these hot-headed situations. But we also can't sidestep the fact that as much as Republicans are making some decent points about funding overseas versus domestic spending, at every single turn and every single example, they have also opposed domestic spending. So how can you make the case that we need to pull back from Ukraine because people in East Palestine are suffering, or people in Maui are suffering, or people in Flint, or the opioid crisis and fentanyl and all of these things, if you have not blessed a single federal dollar going to any of those causes?
Well, federal dollars historically, while they do play an important role in some cases, I know we've talked about this before, but the idea that the government is there to take care of everything is kind of fundamentally in disagreement.
I just named a bunch of disaster instances where federal money is absolutely indicated.
And that money is different in those cases. The federal government is there to respond in cases of, you know, terrible tragedies and
Maui,
national security and things like
Flint.
that. The federal government is not there to run your life and decide how you do that, or to provide everything that you need. Because inevitably, as we've seen from Congress's inability to find an agreement on a budget and all these things and putting money in Ukraine, the federal government is not your friend. They're not there. You should not rely on them. And that's, you know, you should have states that are well run that can handle things like that. You should have other programs. You should not rely on the federal government. It's a cold argument to make, but the fact of the matter, as we see time and again here in Washington, the federal government cannot be trusted to actually keep you fed, clothed, housed, etc.
The hundreds of millions of people who are on some combination of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid,
that are going to be insolvent soon.
And who consider those to be the most popular policies in America, and policies that stand between most seniors and a life of penury on the street, feel very differently. But we can get back to this question at hand. What do you make of Matt Gaetz's argument that for the average Republican watching this, as much as the mainstream news is framing this as Republicans in disarray, what a disaster, and that's including corporate Fox media coverage, which is not on the whole very happy about what Matt Gaetz has done, that to people sitting at home and thinking for themselves, when they look at the alternatives to Speaker McCarthy as Speaker of the House, anything, especially maybe Jim Jordan and Scalise, feel like an upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to watch how quickly both Jordan and Scalise announced, and you have sort of on the side of the House Republican Conference people who were in leadership under McCarthy looking to basically just move up a rung on the ladder, right? You have Scalise wanting to become Speaker, then you have Tom Emmer wanting to become the Majority Leader, moving up from the whip position. So you have sort of that kind of falling in line, rising up, sort of almost entitled to it. On the other side, you have Jim Jordan, who historically has been more of the outsider with the House Freedom Caucus back when he was chairman of that group. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out next week after the candidate forum on Tuesday, and then supposedly starting the Speaker elections on Wednesday. Obviously, last time that took 5 days. Hopefully this time it doesn't take that long. But I think a lot of the outrage at what just took place is based around this idea that Republicans theoretically have a great case for governing, right? If you look at the polls, the American people favor Republicans over Democrats when it comes to prosperity, when it comes to national security. Joe Biden's approval numbers are in the toilet and seemingly sinking every day. He's just not doing well at this. So Republicans should have every opportunity to make that case and win in 2024. That was the same thing they thought in 2022, and obviously the red wave never materialized. And I think a lot of Republicans are watching, voters and sort of partisan pundits as well, watching this scenario set up again where Republicans might be poised to again snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in an election cycle that should be all theirs. And so I think it's in some cases less about the policies and the things Matt Gaetz is saying, because what he says has often changed throughout his time in Congress based on what sort of is the outside contrarian position. And I think it's more concerned that, okay, just because maybe what he's saying is right, this is making the case live on national television frequently to the American people that Republicans are really not that great at governing compared to Democrats. And I think that's why a lot of people are nervous, is because it makes that case very clear right before we have, the 2023 elections happening here in Virginia. We have ballot questions in Ohio. 2024 general election is coming up. It's not a great look for Republicans. And so that's a lot of the unhappiness that unfortunately comes at the expense of discussing the policies and the reasons why Matt Gaetz found himself outside with the 7 other members.
I hear you. My instinct, my observation is now that that's what's motivating this. I don't think that most people sit around and think, well, how's Congress governing today? How's the governing going? Who's good at governing? I don't know that I've ever said the word governing in my entire life outside of the context of sitting at this table. And most of the times I've ever said it were in the last 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. What people do, and they don't also speak in policy terms, but they know they are struggling and they know they don't support sending money to Ukraine while they're struggling. Mm-hmm. And you can call it a contrarian position, but if your contrarian position is only contrarian in Congress and not in the world, not in the country, you're in a pretty good position. And that's exactly why these force the vote moments are so important. Why progressives, I'm sorry, again, we're pushing for the squad members to make a big to-do about issues like universal health care, which 88% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans and 70% of independents supported in the middle of a pandemic when nobody had health care because they were losing their jobs, and we have employer-based health care. When majorities of Americans want a raise to the minimum wage, when a majority of Americans support these worker rights, this is a moment to be doing exactly what Matt Gaetz is doing. And I'm very interested to see how this continues to pan out. Of course, we'll be covering that going forward. Please do stick around. More Rising after this.